Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie, and I am the NOAA Central Librarian who will be hosting today's seminar. Today's seminar is a part deux. It is the part 2 of using NOAA data DOIs, or well, DOIs in general. This one is focused on data. Last month, we focused on publications. So today's is on data, and presenting for us is Don Collins of NCEI, who is an oceanographer and archivist. Don Collins has more than 30 years of experience working at NOAA data centers, starting at the National Oceanographic Data Center, which merged with other NOAA data centers in 2015 to become the National Centers for Environmental Information, NCEI. Don is the current lead, for the NOAA Data IDs Working Group and the NCEI Data Citation Team. He leads a team of science data managers that work on acquiring, ingesting, and archiving data at NCEI, and is the current product owner for Project Collection Manager Tools Team. One of his current activities is working with the NOAA Data Strategy Team to identify and provide guidance about using appropriate licenses for environmental data archived at NCEI. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Don to continue our series on DOIs.
Okay, thanks a lot, Katie. Hello, everyone. Thanks for that introduction. And I'm going to carry on from the discussion that was started last month by Jenn and use loosely, very loosely, use her references to Top Gun images. So, but today I'm going to be focusing on NOAA data DOIs and how data DOIs are the same and different a little bit from the publication DOIs that Jenn talked about last month. So here's the agenda that we're going to be talking about today, and a lot of my slides are very similar to what Jenn had last month, and so hopefully this will reinforce some of the basic underpinnings of both the publication and data DOIs. So we'll talk about what data DOIs are and are not, some of the policies and procedures that we use at NCEI for data DOIs, what to do to get one, and then how these can be used. So with that, what's a NOAA data DOI? And another way to think of that is how is this any different from a publication DOI? Well, they're generally not, but think of it, the way I think of it and approach it is it's a digital identifier for some type of, in this case, data object, not an identifier for a necessarily digital object, because non-digital objects can actually get a DOI as well. So as was discussed last time and a little bit more today, we have the NOAA Data Citation Procedural Directive in its version 1 form, which covers both data and publication DOI information. And there's a new version 2 of that that's nearly done and ready for public consumption. I'm not quite sure where it is in the process, but I think it's very close to being the new and improved and fully released version of the Data and Publications Citation Procedural Directive. And it only defines 2 kinds of objects that can get some kind of a digital identifier, DOI. It defines data and it defines publications. And so we want to be sure that we're thinking in terms of data DOIs, just as with publication DOIs, it's a persistent identifier to some unique thing that is being a digital object most of the time, and that is actually archived at NCEI. That's one characteristic of the data DOIs. It's a unique identifier so that it points always to the same archival object at NCEI, and it's actionable or resolvable. It's when you follow that link, it always goes, when you use that DOI, it will always point to a descriptive landing page for the digital object in this case, or the data object that is identified and linked to the DOI. And NCEI has landing pages that describe in more detail about what the data are that are represented in that digital object or in that archival object. And so that additional metadata can point to other kinds of digital objects or non-digital objects, cross-reference to publications that are related to those data, and has a lot more information, but the DOIs, the URLs for the DOIs always resolve to that landing page. So as borrowing from a couple of the slides from Jenn from last week, just as a refresher, a reminder, DOI structure is two pieces: the prefix, which is provided by our data citation provider. In this case, it's currently an organization DataSite. And so that 10.25921 part is the prefix for NOAA data. There was a different prefix for NOAA publications. The suffix, the part in blue over here, is the the specific unique subcomponent that identifies this particular object that has the digital identifier. And so, together, those two pieces, the prefix and the suffix, make the DOI. And if you put this part here in front of that, it makes it a DOI URL. And so when citing data, just as with citing publications, you should always use the URL representation of your DOI. A few things that they're not, again, borrowing from what Jenn mentioned last time. It's not a placeholder, so our data DOIs are associated to some specific collection of data that's in one or more of our archival packages. That is that tangible object that's gotten this digital identifier. Once we create the DOI, we can't reassign them, we can't change them. They are what they are, and that's what they will remain to be linked one way or another to the object that we have identified it with. And it's not a URL, as we saw on the previous slide. The data DOI is the pointer, it's the identifier that can be used in part of a URL so that it actually takes you to the landing page, but it's the metadata that is maintained by our digital object identifier provider can change where we actually are pointing to, but the DOI itself will always resolve to wherever we tell it to point to. And so we maintain that, but the DOI itself won't change. So I mentioned earlier, there's the version 1 of the Data Citation Procedural Directive that's in force across all of NOAA. This is where we get our policy guidance. It talks about both data and publications. The version 2 has some new and improvements in how we define how we're going to implement DOIs in both publications and data, and that'll be out very soon. Jenn mentioned last time in her briefing that there was an institutional repository document policy, which is really good, and that applies to NOAA's publications. NCEI doesn't really have an equivalent to that. We simply use the guidance and policy definition that's in the procedural directive itself as our policy document. So we don't have a separate implementation plan or implementation policy that's equivalent right now to what the library uses for publications. So for data that gets a DOI from NCEI, we point that to resolve to a landing page. And so this is a standard landing page representation for a data set. So it's got the title and the abstract and some tabs here and how can you download the data over here. And here in this little box it says dataset identifiers. In this case, one of those dataset identifiers is that digital object identifier that's right there. But it also has that dataset citation. So this is just clicking on that little box there. And so it shows the full citation for this particular data set. It's got the author list, publication date, title, publisher, and down here it's got the DOI as a link to that. So if you click that link, it'll actually just bring you back to the same page. But that's all part of that landing page. But then down here in one of these tabs, or more than one of these tabs usually, there may be pointers to related publications about this, or if this were an oceanographic cruise, for example, it might also point to the cruise report that's in the institutional repository. So we can make those linkages between the data that are archived at NCEI and the publications that are in the repository at the library. I'm going to stop for a quick sip of water here. Okay, so what data can get a data DOI? Well, in general, most data that we get are eligible to get a DOI, but we have different constraints that may apply. And so the best approach is to say, NCEI, I'd like to get a DOI for my data that I'm sending to be archived at NCEI. And then we work out with you what the appropriate granularity for those data might be. So it may be an entire cruise gets one DOI, even though it's collecting multiple types of data, or it might be different components of data that were collected from different platforms, or I was just in a meeting this morning talking about how we can clarify and be working to have a more clear set of guidance that we can give about that granularity. But really the short answer is have that discussion with NCEI when you are preparing to send data to us. But also as a reminder, as documented in the procedural directive, we definitely want to work with whoever we need to be sure that we have the appropriate granularity, but ultimately NCEI has the final say. And so, not to be heavy-handed about it or anything, but we've been pretty good about finding a reasonable, mutually satisfactory accommodation for assigning a data DOIs as necessary with our data providers. What can't get a DOI for data? Well, if like with the library, if these data already have a DOI from somewhere else, then we won't mint another DOI for it. That would just confuse the issue. The current representation and the current procedural directives say data that aren't archived at NCEI can't get a NOAA data DOI. Must be under, as it says in the procedural directive, must be under archival control of NCEI prior to minting the DOI. And we do that for the reason that we don't want to give out this permanent identifier on the expectation that we will have data to link it to, and then for any number of reasons that may happen, we never end up getting that DOI, or that data object, that data collection or whatever, and now we have a permanent identifier to something that we don't actually have in our control. So that's why that's in there for now. Given that constraint, a new group has been designated by NOAA's Environmental Data Management Committee, the EDMC, to start looking at the next generation of the procedural directive so that we can address the issue of, well, what about NOAA data that NCEI, for whatever reason, may not be able to or may not have in its collection in our archival holdings. And so that's an ongoing activity that's just starting to get underway. And so there'll be more about that coming up, I'm sure, and lots more discussion and lots more opportunity to comment on that over the course of the next several months. I have a feeling that that'll be a topic of one of the sessions, of one or more of the sessions possibly, at the Environmental Data Management Workshop that's later on in the summer in August. So stay tuned for that, and certainly be in touch through your local chain of command to stay tuned to the EDMC's discussion on that topic. And then another thing that we would not particularly mint a DOI for at NCEI are things like cruise reports or other publications that actually should be in the institutional repository. And so this is again an instance where putting the right piece of information in the right place is very helpful, and then letting us know, oh, my cruise report is in the IR, so we want to be sure that there's metadata linking these data to that cruise report, and let the library know, oh, there's data at NCEI that goes with this cruise report, and forming that, that connection through the metadata. How does one go about getting a DOI for data? Well, first thing is, well, ask us. We only create a DOI at present if we're asked to do so. And usually that's part of the submission process, either directly through our send to NCEI tool. There's a comment field at the end, and many times data providers will say, we'd like to get a DOI for these data. If accepted by NCEI or whatever, some kind of statement to that effect, that alerts us that this is data that we want to be sure gets a DOI if we do indeed archive those data. And really it's about planning and preparing ahead. Nowadays, most publishers are asking or even demanding that there's some kind of link to data that are represented in the article or publication that they're publishing. And so the time to be talking with NCEI about getting a DOI for the data that goes into that article is at least about the same time that you might be talking to a publisher about publishing your research, because as with the publication process for journal articles and research, there's some time delay that may be involved in the process for getting a data DOI and getting data into NCEI's archives. And so the sooner that we are aware that these data need a DOI and that they're related to publication, the easier it is for us to be sure that we can work in a timely fashion to support that request. We've had a few instances where the article is supposed to be published tomorrow, and they told us we need a DOI and we need a DOI, and we struggle within the archival community at NOAA to be able to turn something around that quickly sometimes. So the thing to do is plan ahead. If you're talking with a publisher about publishing something or submitting something for a publisher's review, be sure to also be submitting your data to NCEI to begin that archival process. And again, just to reemphasize, you know, it's much better to be cross-referencing data to publications, but we need to be sure we know about it, and also the library knows about it, so that we can adjust our metadata as necessary as we go forward. So what do you need? Well, aside from the need for a publication DOI or a data DOI in this case, first of all, the data. So it's really best if data are in one of NCEI's preferred file formats. We have a table on our website that says these are our preferred data formats. Data in these formats move pretty smoothly into our archival system. They're considered archive ready. And many times those formats are familiar to a specific community of data users. They support, threads data services and things like that for subsetting and other online application tool development. We also have accepted formats. Well, we accept those, but those kinds of accepted formats may not provide the same level of interoperability or machine readability or things like that that many of our preferred formats provide. And data that are not in a format that's on that table doesn't necessarily mean we won't take it. It just means we need to have a discussion about whether that format is something we can support, we can understand, or is that data that we need to have a negotiation about transforming into something that is more usable over the long term. Because, keeping in mind that data that we acquire, many of the kinds of data that NCEI archives, we're required by law to retain for 20, 30, 50, 75 years. And so we need to be thinking about, will this be something that can be understood and meaningful in 40 or 50 years or 75 years or longer than 75 years? So those are kind of the plug for things to be thinking about with your data and in preparation for putting them into NCEI and thus getting also this durable long-term identifier. Having a browse graphic is also important and necessary to get a DOI. Some good choices, location plots or trackline plots, some kind of waterfall plot of the data if that's really what makes the most sense for the kind of data you're dealing with, or a satellite view of an area or something like that. Those typically convey information about the data itself. Things that aren't usually as good of a choice is a picture of a lab setup or some kind of tabular textual image, because that image, that browse graphic, is right there prominently displayed on the landing page. And so at a glance, someone who comes across that landing page might see, I thought these data were supposed to be in the Gulf of Mexico, but I can see here they're in the Gulf of Alaska. So I don't really need that kind of data, even if it has a DOI or not. At a glance, you can tell sometimes this is where I want it to be, or something about what I'm really trying to look for. And another thing that is necessary for DOI purposes is an author list in the desired order. So, who's the first author, who's the second author, and so on. And using, standard bibliographic citation structure, is beneficial. Last name, comma, first name, initial, whatever. If it's a person, organization name. If it's a corporate author, it's encouraged to not use a bunch of acronyms as the organization name if it's a corporate author's name. Maybe a few, NOAA is okay. OGSSD may or may not translate well to everyone who sees that particular acronym as an example, or DSD, where I work, the Data Stewardship Division at NCEI. Yes, so we're to kind of wrap things up here a little bit. We do want to help out. We provide the DOI. It always points to that data collections landing page. regardless of where we may move it around internally on our file systems, and as we migrate to cloud archiving systems in the next few years, or whenever we do that, we will always provide that link between the DOI and the landing page. But we really, at this point at least, need to have a copy of some data to be able to generate that DOI to begin with. Just a couple of recent changes. One of the things that was not considered in the first procedural directive version was reserving a DOI. And by reserving a DOI, I mean we get a data information package from a data provider, and so we can create that DOI, but for whatever reason, for some valid reason, we don't make those data available to the public immediately. Much of our data is made more or less immediately available to the public. Sometimes, for publication purposes or whatever, there's a request, don't release my data until my publication is also out. And so in version 2 of the procedural directive, we've realigned and redefined, we've redefined how we create the DOIs and use this reserved DOI concept to be in alignment with the data access procedural directive and the data sharing procedural directive for cooperative institutes, grants, and contract staff. So they have different timelines for how long can transpire between, until data are expected to be released. And so for federal staff, we can reserve and hold a DOI for data up to 12 months. For cooperative institute and others, we can hold that reserved DOI for up to 24 months. But we still need to have your data in hand at NCEI, and then we'll create the DOI. And we won't release the DOI to be publicly discoverable until the data are ready to be publicly discoverable. So the DOI is there for putting into a publication or putting into whatever, into the data files themselves. Sometimes people have done that as well. Okay, and finally, using data DOIs is really a bibliographic citation mechanism. So you can use the DOI to find data, just as you would use a publication DOI to look for and discover a link and direct your access to some kind of publication. And then for citing data, it should always be a full citation, just as we've described here. Here's this example that, that this is the example that was on that landing page, and here's the link to those data and to the landing page. And having a data DOI, not only has become a requirement for many publishers, but it also facilitates more open sharing, more open discovery, those FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable principles that are growing in importance all the time, to be sure that our science and our data is open and accessible and easily used. And it also is a benefit for the data providers, because just as with publications, the citations of data can be measured and tracked, and we've had discussions about, well, these data have been, we've got this much data in this area and almost no data in that area, and we've discovered that through bibliographic citation of data. So let's focus our attention on the area with fewer data that are described and documented, for example. That's been one of our examples. So for the same bibliometric citation analyses uses as publications, the data DOIs work the same way. So with that, I'll stop. Happy to field as questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Don. That was very enlightening about how NOAA's data gets archived and can be found. So if anyone has questions, I'm not seeing any in the question panel right now, but if you do have a question, please type that into the chat or question panel, and we can field those to Don. If you don't have a question, we can all wrap a bit early. But going once, going twice. I'm going to give everyone 30 more seconds. I'm going to ask, we do have Jenn Fagan-Fry, who did the first part of this DOI series. She is on as well. Jenn, could you highlight how the IR links to these DOIs?
Yeah, the data DOIs. So
Yes.
whenever someone submits a publication to us through our form or via email, we do ask if they have a dataset DOI to include that information in their submission. As we prepare the item to put it into the repository, that data DOI goes into our metadata, and then it becomes available as a supporting file for the publication. So if you have a journal article and you used NOAA data within there, and that data is housed at NCEI, we take the DOI from NCEI and put that in as our supporting file link. And then that way, anyone who finds the publication can trace it right back to the original data.
Don, is that similar how it works for NCEI? Do you link to the publication through the IR's a DOI?
If we know it, yes. So that, I mean, that's the most efficient way to create that link. We recognize that, you know, not everything has a DOI, and so we can at least put a citation to publications that don't have DOIs into our metadata. But, you know, the key point is we have to know it exists, and we don't have the resources typically to find out if something exists, if that makes sense. So, you know, tell us and we'll include it. Just as Jenn was saying, you know, there's a place, say, you know, here, put the link to your data here. I don't know that our infrastructures typically explicitly ask that, though.
Oh, something to work on.
So that, yeah, no, that is a good point, and that is something for us to be sure to be asking into the, you know, as we move forward.
Yeah,
We do have,
just to echo that quickly before you jump to that question, Katie. It really is a matter of, if you tell us, we can make sure those links are there. It's just a matter of people notifying us. When it comes to publications and being able to identify a data set DOI, I think we have a little bit of an easier time getting that info on occasion, not always. Which is why we always ask for it, because we can double check what we're able to locate. So really the thing I want to stress there is notifying one or the other. I will say that we as in the IR team try to work pretty closely with Don and the NCEI team so that we can link up and share information back and forth. That is still a work in progress. But, you know, if you share it with one of us, it will make its way to the other team, just not very quickly. So if you notify both teams, it gets there, and it's there more efficiently and quickly.
Right, absolutely. Yes,
great.
we do try to keep those channels of communication open.
Great. I'm going to grab these two questions. They're very similar. So I'm just going to try and summarize them together. What about data that updates regularly or new versions of a data set? Do you need new DOIs for each one?
Well, unfortunately, like so many questions when it comes to archiving data, the answer is best as it depends. So within NCEI, we have a lot of mechanisms for archiving data, and they, I think, generally all have a mechanism for distinguishing between different versions of a data set. I mean, you know, that term itself, data set, can be can become a very controversial concept in some places, and so it's the kind of thing that would be beneficial to have a discussion with NCEI beforehand to make sure that we understand what the need is and that we understand what the best strategy might be, because in some cases it may simply just be we have a new version of the same data. It's just I'm not even going to try to give an example off the top of my head, unfortunately. It's a new version of something we already have that extends it in these ways, and it makes most sense to just say, yeah, this is version 3 of the same thing, and we may have just one DOI for that collection. There may be other instances, though, where for whatever reason, it makes more sense to create a new DOI for this data set because there's something about it that is inherently different than the sort of an extension of what was there before. So it's going to be part of that dialogue that's really necessary for us to be sure we're taking a reasonable approach to whether it should just be the same one or get a different one. I always hate to give the, well, it depends answer, but unfortunately, often that's the case.
No, that's okay. I hope the two folks who asked that, if they need to reach out to you to discuss that.
Yes.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. So if anyone has further questions that they're not asking, you can reach out to Dawn at donald.collins@noaa.gov. And also questions primarily about data IDs, noaa.data.ids@noaa.gov. Thank you all for tuning in today. If you want to pass this on to a colleague, or if you missed a section of it that you want to revisit, we did record this and the presentation will be up on the library's YouTube channel shortly. Thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful and safe rest of your Thursday.
Thank you very much.